Welcome to Prohibition Theology. This is where we talk about stuff that you cannot ask about in your church. I mean, you can, but if you do, people are going to look at you like you're strange or you're an outsider. That's probably because you are. Why is that, by the way, that we divide the world up into insiders and outsiders? And of course, we are insiders because we're the ones who determine which is which. Well, it's because as humans, we're looking for meaning and we're looking for security within that search for meaning. That's essentially the reason. So we all do it. It's not like this is just some, it's only Christians or only religious folk or only whatever. You see it in sports, you see it in politics, you see it everywhere. The problem is when that kind of thinking leads to arrogance. And my question today is, do Christians have an arrogance problem? And my answer is yes and yes. And the reason there are two yeses is simply because we have divided the world into two areas, two spheres, inside, outside. My contention is that Christians have an arrogance problem in both spheres, and that's what this video is about. Let me tell you, first of all, what I don't think the problem is. I don't think it's just people having arrogance kind of in their heart, in their soul, or something like that. They're sort of born into that state of arrogance, or they, it came upon them or something. No. No, what I'm talking about here is something that has to do with an area of life that few people ever stop to think about, and that is how we think. It has to do with, yes, how we interpret, but also how we relate. It has to do with how we compare the value of things like doctrine, sort of set in stone, statements of faith, that kind of stuff, on the one hand, and relational understandings of truth on the other hand. Now, it would be easy to make a strong case that the Bible is way more interested in relational truth than it is in doctrinal truth. I think that's absolutely the case, and I'm quite happy to make the case for it. And I wouldn't be the first one to do it. But there aren't that many people who do that. Most people look at the Bible from the perspective of doctrine. Is our doctrine sound in terms of the Bible? Or, and this is the worst option, one is bad, the other is worse. The worst option is to start with your doctrine and then to simply read the Bible as if it were a reflection of that. That's completely upside down, but my main problem right now is not to differentiate between good doctrine and bad doctrine. I'm not super interested in doctrine, frankly. I'm interested in human experience. I'm interested in how as human beings we affect each other, how faith affects us, how relationality with God, with each other affects us. That's the stuff that I think really matters. That's the stuff that I think the Bible is actually about. Now, back to the question, do Christians have an arrogance problem? I said yes, and here's why. It basically boils down to this essential issue of preferring doctrine over relationality. Now, I'm not thinking that most people, if you ask them and if you laid this out before them, that they would pick doctrine. I don't think so. However, our Christian world is run by Christian institutions, and they have an identity to preserve, at least they think they do. And in order to do that, they come up with these strange things like statements of faith. We believe this, and this. We denounce whatever. And you cannot drink alcohol or blah, blah, blah. Whatever it is. The preference for that is not one by people as such. The preference for that is an institutional one. And people who know me know that I don't think very highly of institutionality. I think more highly of people. I think more highly of relationality. And when institutions stop being helpful towards relationality, towards the actual experiential needs of people, that's when I get really nervous. And this is just another case of that. So my point is that this arrogance problem, which I'm going to just say a little bit more about in a minute, this arrogance problem is ultimately rooted in the preferentiality that Christians have shown towards the doctrinal versus the relational. And yes, I'm blaming institutions for that. And that explains, by the way, why you can't walk into that church and say, hey, I have a real question here. It has to do with, who am I in this world other than a wretched sinner who needs to be saved? As a person, my issues, my problems, my promises, my grieving, my joys, and all of that, you can only do that to the extent that it fits the doctrinal paradigm of that church. If you stray beyond that, the confines of that, if you go somewhere else, you're going to be in trouble, quite likely. Of course, it's true there are also churches that don't care very much about that, but the reality is churches as institutions will welcome you as an insider, as someone who belongs. Well, one is the negative way of putting it and the other one the positive way. They would welcome you as such to the extent that you agree with whatever culture is being cultivated there. And that's not your call. That's the church's call. And therein lies the problem. The church should be you and everyone else there. The church should not be some institution that says, here's the paradigm, here are the parameters, and here is what you need to do, and here is how you need to look, and here is, what you need to believe, and so on. Okay, so arrogance. How does the arrogance come in? Well, partly for the reasons I just mentioned, but the big one I want to focus on today is actually a different one. I want to focus on the fact that Christians have a very hard time understanding their limitations, their thinking limitations, their philosophical limitations. And this doesn't really get talked about. One reason it doesn't get talked about, it sounds philosophical, and philosophy is like, ooh, let's not go there. We have theology, we have faith. But really, those are different labels for some of the same things. So let's get in there and let's see how this arrogance thing actually works its way out. My starting point here is my contention that Christians are by and large pretty unaware of their limitations on a thinking level, and they're unable to raise these kinds of questions in church, even in seminary, in the educational wing of church, without being given theoretical answers or the cold shoulder or doctrinal things they need to submit to or things like that. But the real issues still remain unaddressed. Okay, so there are these two spheres, the internal sphere inside, and the external sphere outside, where the outsiders are, and churches try to kind of reach out to them so they come in and, become like us. Those are the two spheres. So what is the arrogance that I'm talking about? What does it look like? How does it manifest? Well, in the area of outsiders, Christians engaging with outsiders, it is really a matter of more general expectations that are being placed on the outsider, whereas inside the community, the expectations are a whole lot more specific, a whole lot more detailed. Sometimes they include things even like lifestyle statements and things like that. If you want to be part of us, you have to commit to this, that, and the other thing. And I already told you that I'm not persuaded at all that the essence of Christian faith, of any kind of Jesus-type faith, would have to be or should be about any of this. These are, at best, secondary matters. The primary matter is much more experiential. It has much more to do with what it means to be truly human, and that's a relational question. So, on the outside, with outsiders, the way the arrogance manifests typically is that a set of expectations or claims is being sort of foisted upon them, and they're being invited to essentially agree. And there are appropriate and less appropriate ways of doing this. There's a whole gamut. That's not my point right now. My point is the underlying assumption, which is that Christians are able or claim to be able to have a vantage point on reality that is to some extent superior to that of others. So there are entire churches, programs, seminaries, and even degrees and whatnot, courses that focus on how to persuade someone on the outside, if you will, how they are in need of a fix. A fix for what? A fix for being wretched, a fix for being a worm, a fix for being unworthy. And by the way, if you're wondering whether that kind of theology wouldn't be an affront to God, the Creator, to say, hey, God, thanks for creating us that way. Yeah, absolutely, it would be. And there's a reason why that kind of theology is not really found in the Bible. Is there language like that in the Bible? Yes, there is. Should we interpret it literally? No, we should not. Are we doing it anyway? Yes, we very often do. And that's the problem of biblical interpretation. But that is not my main focus right now. My main focus right now is the fact that many Christians end up with a theology like that, and they foist it upon others, and they're basically saying to them, hey, you may not realize this, but you are a worm, and you need saving, and that's why Jesus died on the cross. It's for you, you. Yeah, for me too, and for that person. But right now, it's really for you, because we individualize everything, even though in the first century, at the time of the New Testament, nobody would have done that. But there you go. It's one of those many ways in which we just do whatever we do, apparently. So we foist this upon other people. We tell them, you're wretched, you need to be saved, Jesus died for you. And then, in the future, you will go to this other place. So just notice that focus here. Most Christians, when they talk about salvation, they talk about the future and they talk about up there. And they call it heaven, the combination of those two things. It's another thing that does not occur like this in the Bible. Does it stop Christians from thinking like that? Apparently not. Why not? Because the narrative is not controlled by people interpreting the Bible well. The narrative is controlled by institutions who have their own agendas. Now, when we switch to the internal side, the community side, the church side, which is its own world. So you have a seminary world, you have the church world, and then you have the world. It's like sort of three spheres here. As we switch to the church world, the same dynamic is at work, but it works itself out a little bit differently. And the main difference here is that the expectations, the mutual expectations, the membership expectations, the lifestyle expectations, and so on, get way more specific. Now, it's not that the New Testament doesn't have any of that. It does have lifestyle expectations, absolutely. And we need to interpret those well. But again, that's not my topic right now. My topic is that we create this alternative society or societies in, churches that are somehow distinct from the world. They don't even have a connection with the seminary anymore because the seminary does whatever the seminary does. I worked there for many years in both conservative and liberal places. I know that scene really well. No, this is its own sphere now, and it's a very pragmatic sphere. And that's what happens typically with institutions. Two things that happen almost certainly once you have an institution is you're going to manage each other, or it's going to be managed top-down rather, typically. And in the world of, corporations and so on, that makes a lot of economic sense. But in the world of a community that claims to have a role in this world of challenging the world, attracting the world into relationship with God, does it still have a place there? I really doubt it. The New Testament certainly doubts it, but churches still do it. So in that sphere, inside of that sphere, the specific requirements that people put on each other or the institution puts on everyone are they go into even more detail than what we might confront an outsider with. But the problem at the core in both of these situations is the same. It's a dual problem. One is we've lost the art of interpreting the texts that really matter to us well. And the other is we have no idea how limited we are in terms of our thinking abilities, even as Christians. I cannot even tell you how many times I've been told, whether it's by students or pastors or generally Christian folk, or you read it in, those little books that you buy in bookstores, 5 steps to go to heaven and 3 steps to be an amazing Christian or whatever, that kind of literature. The thing that you come across time and again is this notion that because Christians somehow have a closer sense of God than non-Christians, because of that, Christians are somehow epistemologically, in terms of their knowing ability, in a higher place, in a higher position. It's a little bit like if you think of a ceiling between us as human beings, in time and space, and we're flesh and blood, and we're sort of physical, empirical beings. If you think of a ceiling between us, and you call that, in philosophy, you might call that immanent, between us and the transcendent, which is not accessible to us. We're not transcendent and we're not God. But if you imagine that ceiling, Christians tend to think, for some reason, and it kind of beats me a little bit why that is, but tend to think that we are somehow in a position to stick our head up there through the ceiling and have a look around and see what it's like up there, and then sort of come back down and then talk literally about that to other people. Now, if we were able to do that, it makes no sense to assume that we're able to do that. But if we were able to do that, of course, we would then be in a position where we could claim authority over other people, or at least, if not over other people, in front of other people. And we could say to people, hey, your position here is really bad. I know because I was up there and I had a look, and mine used to be bad, and this is the fix, and Jesus is the fix. He died for you. There's that individualism again. Died for you, can fix it. And by the way, you then just come to our church and you sign up, and we're going to need a little bit of your money too to make this whole thing work. And that's how your life's going to be fine. It actually won't be affected so much right now, except that you should really come on a weekly basis, maybe find a small group or something, be nice to people. But other than that, it's really going to be once you die. And it's not going to be here. It's going to be in this heavenly zone somewhere, 5.6 billion light years that way, something like that. Am I caricaturing? Yes, but only a little bit, frankly. Okay, let's spend a minute asking how this works out on the internal side, the interior side, that club called church. Now, in that environment, the assumptions, the claims, the expectations are more specific. Typically, are there churches that are different than that? Yes, they are. Some churches are, they're more, frankly, there's a greater emphasis on feeling good, on making you feel good, and less on doctrine and so on. I know there's diversity. I know the landscape. But I'm focusing on the ones where, this doctrinal thing and this lack of awareness about our limitations, even as Christians, in terms of our thinking abilities about the transcendent, where these things really matter and make a difference. And those are the churches, and a negative difference at that. Those are the churches that tend to focus on those statements of faith and that tend to be very explicit on what's acceptable and what's not, in terms of lifestyle, in terms of what you believe, and so on. And here's a specific example for you. And I've been asked this many times over the years as a seminary professor. It has to do with Jesus' resurrection. So Jesus died on a cross. On the third day, the grave is empty. And students might ask me, and other people have asked me that too. So where is the body? That's an interesting question, because we're talking about a transcendent event. The Bible claims that something miraculous happens, something that breaks through that ceiling. And I told you that I think we cannot stick our heads up there. And having the Spirit of God in you doesn't enable you to go up there either. You're still restricted. You're still here and now in this particular situation. And the best thing to do would be to really maximize that in ways other than denying it. Anyway, so back to the issue. So students might ask me, and have asked me many times, so where's the body? And my immediate reaction is I want to say, wait, it seems to me from how you're asking this question that you should be the one answering it, because I'm the one who's essentially arguing for what I would call epistemological humility, which is where you basically say, when it comes to knowing stuff other than what's part of our empirical dimension, we can speculate, we can talk about those things as if we knew them, as if we understood them. But if we think we actually know them and we actually understand them, and we can actually explain them somehow literally, then we're just deluded. And the point of what I'm saying in this video is essentially we're deluding ourselves. We're deluding ourselves into thinking that somehow we can rise up above the rest of humanity and have this peak around, the transcendent world. And then a student comes and says, hey, where's the body? Now, just to be clear, there's nothing better that can happen in a classroom than people asking each other questions and talking about it respectfully. I love, love, love that. And if a student disagrees or I disagree with a student, that's great. We're actually now we have a sphere where we can learn, right? If you just agree with each other, then you're not going to be transformed. That's another problem with statements of faith, but I'm going to leave that on one side for the moment. Okay, so the student asks me, so where's the body? And I'm saying, well, this is after death. This is transcendent. I have no access to that. I cannot tell you where the body is. If I were able to tell you where the body is, then it wouldn't have been resurrection. It would have just been resuscitation, right? It would have been a dead body that was resuscitated. There you go. Here's the body. But that's not what the Bible claims. The Bible claims that what happened with Jesus is a breaking through of the ceiling, if you will, into a transcendent world, which at least at this point we simply do not understand. And even if we understood it, we could not express it literally. I'm essentially saying to the student, your question, there's a problem there. It doesn't actually make a lot of sense, but I'm saying that without saying it, if you see what I mean. So like I said, we need to be respectful in how we talk about it, but we also still need to attend to the hard issues. And the hard issue here is that Christians frequently, regularly, almost as a matter of norm, feel overconfident in their abilities to interpret stuff, even in the transcendent area. And that's astonishing. It's astonishing. Nowhere does the Bible promise that kind of privilege to Christians. Nowhere. In fact, if you ask someone like Paul in 1 Corinthians, he'll be very clear. He says, hey, the way we're talking about this, and this is in the chapters in 1 Corinthians where he prepares for his discussion of resurrection, so chapters basically 13, 14, 15. If you go there and you ask Paul about his epistemology, then, Paul, how do you think about our knowledge abilities? He will say, well, the way we talk about this other dimension is as through a glass, dimly and darkly. We can't really see it. I mean, we're kind of, we're just talking as if we could see it while we perfectly know that we can't see it. And that's exactly right. That is how we should be addressing this issue, instead of raising our heads up there or saying to everyone else that we can that when really we're just deluding ourselves, and then saying to them, so, you're a nice guy. I'm going to tell you, having had the privilege of being up there, I'm going to explain this to you, and here's what you need to do. And there's something incredibly naive about that. And why the heck we cannot talk about this in churches, I do not know. But if you think you can talk about churches, try it. And if you succeed and you get a good conversation going there that is appreciated by the rest of the church, please tell me. I want to hear about it. So, I mentioned the resurrection a minute ago. And what Christians sometimes do, and of course this shows up in statements of faith, you've guessed it. So what Christians often do is they take something like that, they interpret it literally when clearly we don't have a chance of interpreting it literally, nor were we meant to interpret it literally. But Christians, when has that stopped Christians? So we interpret it literally. Then we go to another text, let's say Acts 1. Acts is a book in the New Testament. We go to Acts 1 and talks about essentially ascension. So we say, that body somehow went up. It went up to that heaven that we think is up there and that way. And that will be our kind of final destination at some point in the future. And then they go to another text, let's say 1 Thessalonians, chapters 4 and 5. It's a letter in the New Testament. And that talks about Jesus returning. Actually, we don't give a rip what that text actually means, because that text is a whole web of Old Testament allusions. And if we actually took the trouble to go to the Old Testament and to understand that web, that story web that Paul is using in 1 Thessalonians, we wouldn't literalize the heck out of that text. But we don't care. We literalize the heck out of it. That is what we do. Why do we do that? Because we've been conditioned to know that that's the solution anyway, because that's what shows up in our statements of faith and in our doctrinal books from seminary and whatnot. That's essentially how it works. And maybe I'm simplifying a little bit, but only a little bit. So now we bring it all together. Okay, so we have the resurrection account at the end of the Gospels, then we have Acts 1, and then we have 1 Thessalonians. And we don't care, where these texts come from in context or whatever. We've been conditioned all our lives as Christians to rip passages out of context. I just saw today, I saw this picture of a stadium in England, soccer stadium. And with no people there because of COVID, you could see somebody had rented a whole section for TV. And, it had a Bible verse sort of printed there. How could a Bible verse have anything to do with anything once you've ripped it out of context? It can't. You destroyed it. I mean, it's like you have, a beautiful sea of flowers, and you just rip a petal off a single flower, and you say, hey, look what I found. Never mind what's over there, where I got it. It's ridiculous. It is really ridiculous. And I'm convinced that as Christians, we have, over the decades, maybe centuries, that's another discussion, we have deluded ourselves. And my main focus today is we have deluded ourselves when it comes to knowledge questions. We have the mother of all knowledge crises right here in our midst. And if you think you can raise those issues in the places where you should be able to raise them, which is the sort of the epicenters of Christianity, if you will, whether it's churches or seminaries, good luck. Of course, it's tempting now to point out that other religions are doing the exact same thing. But now I've just compounded the problem, because now people are going to say, wait, are you comparing us to other religions? Because you're not supposed to do that. Why not? You've guessed it, because they're outsiders and we're insiders. That's why. So rather than us engaging with them about how they are addressing the issue of knowledge and the limitations of knowledge among us as humans, rather than do that, we're basically assuming that they simply have to become like us. Right? Isn't that how it goes? Okay, let's wrap this up. I think there are two issues that I want to put into this summary here right at the end. One is we have an awful lot of difficulty interpreting things well. And that's not been my main focus in this video. I've talked about this in other videos. And the other is we are blissfully unaware of how limited we are in our understanding. So rather than learning, how to function, in a healthy manner within those limitations, which is really what we should be doing, instead we pretend that those limitations don't actually exist, and we can kind of go right past them, and we can stick our head up there and look around and come back and then tell other people that we have this incredible, unique knowledge and insight that they don't have, and they just need to obey, because that's the next step, isn't it? That faith gets reduced to a matter of obeying. Obeying what? Well, obeying your or my or that person's understanding of things that we're frankly not capable of understanding, but we still require others to obey. Even in our own communities, we require people to obey. That is what Christianity has come to. That is why some of us have started calling it Christendom, with all the polemical, negative kind of labeling that's attached to that. And so back to the initial question, do Christians have an arrogance issue? Yes and yes. So what to do about it? I would say the first thing that we would have to do is we would have to attend to and understand who we are in our finite, limited human nature, and kind of throttle back our arrogance a bit on that front. And then positively recover a sense of relationality, because to be human is to be relational. We cannot choose not to be. Sometimes I use a technical term. I say to be human is to be hermeneutical. You cannot opt out of that. To be human is to interpret self, others, stuff, what's inside of you, and so on. To be human is a relational thing. It's an interpretive thing. And if we move even an inch closer to appreciating that well, we will have chiseled away a little bit from the arrogance that is plaguing our worlds both inside and outside.